Stoicism really is a philosophy about progress. There never has been.
Right.
There never has been a perfectly virtuous person. If you just manage to make only a few mistakes, you're doing quite well. Marcus Aurelius, his melancholy is a bit too much for me at times.
Right.
And this
Do you find that in Epictetus?
No, I don't find melancholy at all in Epictetus. What modern Stoics have missed a lot is the challenge. Don't you realize? You're a son of God.
You're one of the greatest, scholars on Epictetus. Do you find this plausible after wrestling with it for so long? The key Stoic message from Epictetus is that happiness is always possible no matter the circumstance. No matter what tragedies may happen, no matter the state of the external world, happiness is always up to you. Epictetus wasn't just talking out of his ass here, because he was born a slave, and yet even slavery did not rob him of his happiness. In some very real sense then, Epictetus was a slave who was free. Now when Epictetus was actually freed, he quickly became one of the most sought-after teachers in Rome. The elite would pay vast sums to send their sons to learn his Stoic art of life, and so ironically, this ex-slave became the teacher to an entire generation of ambitious young men. My guest today is the legendary Epictetus scholar Anthony Long. Professor Long is going to synthesize for us this Stoic curriculum designed to prepare young men to enter the very upper echelons of society. You're going to learn the key ideas of the Stoic Grandmaster and how to achieve a happiness that rises above fortune. If you want to follow along this episode via transcript, or if you want to be invited to one of my lectures, then please join my email list at jonathanb.com. And without further ado, Anthony Long. Tell us about the incredible life of Epictetus.
Right. So Epictetus was born in the about middle years of the 1st century AD of our era. Probably into a slave household. His mother was probably a slave, and this is in what we call central Turkey today, Anatolia. He must have come to Rome as a pretty young guy, maybe perhaps a teenager, and was employed in the household of a man called a very prominent freedman, not a slave, but a freedman called Epaphroditus, who was a very prominent sort of bureaucrat working for the Emperor Nero. And he came across a prominent Roman Stoic philosopher called Musonius Rufus, probably again in his teens. And we don't know much about the next few years, but he was probably consorting with other Roman Stoic philosophers in Rome. And we do know that when the Emperor Domitian, who was a pretty nasty piece of work, came into power towards the end of the century, Stoic philosophers were expelled from Rome, and along with and Epictetus went out with them. A number of prominent Romans who had espoused Stoicism, were very critical of the empire. So they got into trouble that way. And then by now, he was obviously pretty much esteemed by people. And although he didn't have much resources of his own, he must have had enough to be able to move to a very fine Greek city called Nicopolis on the coast of the Adriatic, and founded his own school there. And we know about that school quite a lot because he refers to students in his discourses, and he must have been quite famous by now because he was almost certainly visited by the Emperor Hadrian, which is quite something for the emperor to come and visit an ex-slave. Yes, I should explain, of course, that he was manumitted. He received his freedom again, probably. Under the time he was in with Epaphroditus. But it's very important, I think, for understanding Epictetus's some of his preoccupations to realize that he had been born a slave. And freedom is such a very important notion in his writings. And we don't know too much about his life. I mean, he taught in this school, and the record of his work that we have is very much something like a transcript of his lectures. And the people he's talking to in his discourses are very young guys. I mean, they're males, they're only males, probably varying in age from about 16 to 24. Although, you know, the message of the discourses can be extremely grown up and even brutal at times. But it's important to recognize that these are young guys, whose parents have wanted them to go and study with Epictetus.
And they were from prominent families.
Oh,
and,
yes,
and a lot of them wanted to go into public service, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, the writer called Arrian, who is the source of our knowledge of Epictetus, became an extremely prominent Roman. He became a Roman consul. He wrote copiously on various things. He wrote a history of Alexander the Great, and he produced 8 volumes of these transcripts of Epictetus. He's trying to capture the way Epictetus spoke. And it clearly has done, because, I mean, the style is totally different from his other style. It's in the colloquial Greek called the Koine, the Greek of the New Testament. And he's sometimes the discourses are Epictetus simply speaking. Sometimes they're like a dialogue where he's meeting somebody else. And they're quite unique. I think, I mean, there's nothing really else like this in ancient Greek and Roman literature. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, of course, is writing to himself. But here is somebody...
And Epictetus was one of his big inspirations.
Oh,
yes.
Huge. It's mind-boggling to think that the most powerful man in the world is being a kind of putting himself at the feet of that ex-slave.
Yes, and that is what I found most attractive about Epictetus' life.
Yeah.
And this quote of your book summarizes it quite well. Epictetus contrasts radically with the immensely wealthy and powerful Seneca, another famous Roman Stoic, who was not a practicing teacher and whose Stoicism, though certainly sincere, was fully tested only in old age when Nero, the emperor, forced him to commit suicide. Freedom and slavery had long been metaphors for states of mind and attitudes pertaining to people irrespective of their social status. Yet when, as often, Epictetus calls one of his freeborn students slave, we ought to remember that Epictetus actually knew the indignity of slavery from direct experience and who had also lived under the tyrannical regime of Domitian. Epictetus' philosophy acquires an experiential dimension that removes from it any vestige of mere theorizing or posturing.
Right.
That is what I find so attractive about this philosophy, is that it is born out of and engendered a very admirable life.
Yes. Yeah, and just you know, since you asked me about the biography, Epictetus never married. I think, I mean, as a freedman, he could have had a wife, but he apparently didn't. But he did adopt, apparently, a young girl in his older age, and had a woman to kind of help look after her. So he had something like a family life. And another nice little anecdote about him is that he tells us himself, he cultivated a very simple life, didn't have a lot of property, but apparently he had a lamp, which he was quite proud of.
A lamp?
A lamp, a metal lamp. And it was stolen. And Epictetus has a very wry sense of humor. He says something about, well, I guess the guy who stole it thought he needed it, but next time he'll find a pure earthenware pot.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Now I want to spend the rest of the interview examining the actual ideas and the teachings of Epictetus.
Yes.
The central claim, my understanding of Epictetus' Stoicism, is that virtue itself is necessary and sufficient for happiness, right? That for the full sage, happiness is not harmed by external circumstances as long as he himself responds to it with appropriate agency. When I read your book, there seems to be 4 different ways that he argues for this. The first way is via ethics, and this is the kind of arguments you find in Plato's Gorgias or the Euthydemus or the Meno. And it's to go through each of the external goods like money, wealth, power, and show how they're not always goods. And whereas virtue, wisdom is something you would always want as good. That's the first type of argument. The second type of argument proceeds from what is in and not in our control. And the long short of it is, if happiness is to be in our control, full control, then we ought only desire what is in our control, and that turns out to be virtue. The third argument, independently from the ethics argument, seems to proceed from nature, that we are just the type of creatures that virtue is suitable for. And the last kind of argument seems to proceed from some kind of theology, right? That this is how Zeus, this is how God acts, or these are the laws prescribed to us from Zeus. We're going to spend the next hour and a half diving into each of these arguments. But just give us a brief overview. What do you take of these four arguments to be the central one, if there is one, of Epictetus, and how do they relate to each other?
Thank you. Let me just say something at the very beginning. I mean, yes, I mean, like any Stoic, he does think that the goal of life is trying to perfect our reason, and if we do that correctly, we will achieve virtue. But I would like to say, I mean, there isn't actually very much talk in Epictetus himself about virtue, and I think the reason for that is that he is a teacher teaching these young boys, and his focus is not so much on, as it were, the finished product, the ideal Stoic life. The
Stoic sage, right?
Yes. Very, very little about, I think hardly ever talks about Stoic wisdom. It's about progress. And I think this is something, again, very, very attractive about Stoicism as a philosophy. Stoicism really is a philosophy about progress. There is this kind of Archimedean point which no one has ever reached of infallible wisdom and virtue. But all the focus is upon striving towards this as an ultimate objective. And Epictetus typically will make remarks like, don't in fact expect perfection. If you just manage to make only a few mistakes, you're doing quite well. The actual curriculum and product what you're trying to achieve is how to approximate to something like this condition of virtue, rather than actually,
attain it, right?
Yes, and doing it, by putting yourself into situations where you're challenged. So a lot of the discourses are intended to challenge people and sort of say, how would you deal, if you were faced with imprisonment, or how would you deal with that? It's a kind of applied Stoicism. Now, at the same time, you're quite right. We do want to look at certain kind of principled notions that are involved in the project. So let me start with, I think, the one that we mentioned last, the theology. This is a big problem for modern Stoics, a lot of modern Stoics, because, most of us are not going to be able to believe quite as easily as it seems that some Stoics did in divine providence, or thinking that this is the best of all possible worlds, and least of all, that there's nothing's ultimately valuable except virtue. But I do think that for Epictetus, he quite often has a little dialogue in which Zeus, that is the divine principle in Stoicism, is actually a spokesperson. The quotation he loves particularly of Cleanthes, the early Stoic Cleanthes, says, "Guide me, Zeus, whither you have appointed me, and I will follow without flinching. And even if I don't follow, I will go nonetheless." So this, embedded in this little saying, I think are two things. One is determinism. One is that the world couldn't be different from the way it is. The causality is complete. It's a closed system. And so if you knew the first event in the world's history, and the world actually operates according to a series of everlasting cycles, the last event would be the last link in that chain. So that's determinism. but it's also not only the way things had to be or couldn't be otherwise, but the way they should be according to this divine principle. So there are two prongs to this. One is the deterministic thesis of causality, and the other is that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Right.
Now, people are going to find that very hard to follow, I think, and today. But I think without it, certainly Epictetus' Stoicism doesn't, I think, really make full sense unless you accept both principles.
Right.
Because, well, otherwise it's going to be quite counterintuitive to think facing execution or my family being thrown into slavery is the best state of the world.
Right. That kind of fundamental affirmation about reality ceases to...
And yet Epictetus, I think, and I think Orthodox Stoicism is committed to saying that if we only understood everything about the way, because not only the causality, but also the values involved, we would have to see that this was the best.
Right. Let me give you a quote from your book on this religious argument. Theology mainly enters traditional Stoicism not as the beginning or even as a part of ethics, but rather as the culmination of physics, the study of nature. Epictetus, however, thought that his best chance of consolidating the claims of orthodox Stoic doctrines was to present them as foundational laws of nature. That is to say, as laws of a divinity dedicated to engendering in human beings the resources to make themselves happy. He, Epictetus, imagines a student whom he has instructed in the thesis that nothing is of concern to us except our volition, asking for guidance, and says to him, "What am I to prescribe to you? Hasn't Zeus already done that? Has he not given you things that are yours, free from impediment and hindrance, and things that are not yours, which are subject to impediment and hindrance? Since you have these legacies and instructions from Zeus, what kind do you still want from me? Am I superior to him or more trustworthy?"
Yeah.
That quote, at least, made it sound like something even stronger than just a determinism or a divine providence, but that he's actually using kind of a, I don't want to say faith-based, that might have too much Christian connotations, but he wants to ground Stoic principles on some kind of super-rational, divine teaching. Is that a fair way to understand Epictetus?
I think that is right. The claim is that if only we could have this sort of God's eye perspective, which of course we can't have. We can only approximate to it because we may be able to see aspects of it, but we can't get the total picture. But if we could see all the causal factors, then a lot of things that we would think of as undesirable are not only inevitable, but actually do fit into the cosmic plan.
Right.
And I mean, so an example of this would be in the very first discourse, where he's imagining having a conversation with Zeus. And he imagines Zeus saying, if I could have made your body invulnerable and free from, pain, of course I would have done that. But this wasn't possible. And why wasn't it possible? And he gives a very intelligent answer. He says, because you're made of flesh and blood. But what I have done, so this is you speaking, is to give you a part of myself. So a part of himself is the intellect and rational capacities to understand, to see, to understand. So that's the gift.
Right.
And so he'll then say in the next discourse, he'll say, don't you realize, you're a son of God. I mean, hasn't got the Christian sense of son of God, but it means that the human, what's special about being human within the universe of animals is that we have the same basic mental nature as the divine. That's an amazing thought, really. There's this amazing little discourse where he imagines himself going to bed and drawing the blinds and then saying to himself, you're not alone. You're not alone because your own divinity and the divinity is with you too. The Stoic is not alone. And he's not alone both in a kind of metaphysical sense, because he is a kind of metaphysically connected up with everything else, but in the ethical and sort of psychological sense that the divine is within you and
Right. And so just to clarify here, my understanding of the Stoic religion was that God, or maybe logos is a better word, permeates all.
Yes.
And so it's almost like this Hegelian spirit that underlies everything. It's the logic of everything. It's the rational nature of your soul as well as the rational organization of the cosmos. But it does get personified into Zeus and singular deities.
Yes. That's correct, I think. Yes, so yes, you can think of it...
Not just figuratively.
You could think of it in some purely physical sense as, the cause or the energizing aspect. So a mineral is structured, has Zeus in it. But Zeus in propria persona, Zeus in his identity as the divine mind, is personalized by Epictetus. And
not just figuratively,
no.
I see.
He doesn't quite say he's a person, right. But he does imply that Zeus and a human being are homologous. I think life is a supreme value for the Stoics, and I'll try to prove that. The Stoics, they took the etymology of Zeus, the name Zeus. You might wonder, why Zeus? Why not just say God? Aristotle just talks about theos, or God, or Plato talks about demiurge. But they go to the word Zeus. Why? They like to play around with etymologies and derive the name Zeus from the word for life, which is Zane. So the name Zeus, as it were, emblematic of life. When Zeus determines that this is the moment to fragment himself and create the world, I think something like a principle of plenitude operates, so that all possible life forms are going to be manufactured, or he's going to turn himself into all these different life forms. Right. And the phrase the Stoics used for this, it's a nice phrase, it's spermatikos logos. Spermatikos means seminal. So it's almost like a kind of precursor of DNA.
The ethical consequence that providence and religion helps achieve is this idea of amorphati, right? This idea of a fundamental affirmation of the world. You can even look at a dead child. And you are right, and I agree with you, that without religion, that is gone. Because in our atomistic worldview, right, of modern physics, it's chaotic. There is no grand purpose even to tragedy. Right. So clearly, religion has some import on founding the theory. But now let's look at the other three pillars I was suggesting, right? The argument from ethics, argument from control, and argument from nature. So let's maybe we start with the ethical argument first. And again, this argument is that we go through all the external goods and we show that none of them necessarily are good. Whereas wisdom, virtue, is always something that brings about good. So maybe to start off, you can give us an overview of what virtue is.
It's the sort of fulfillment or the culmination of reason. So I think that helps us to see why the Stoics think that the four cardinal virtues, courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom itself, and they're each aspect. They imply each other, but none of them would be sufficient by itself. Seneca has a nice example where he says, trying to understand what virtue is, he says, well, there was this guy, who was incredibly courageous, and he fought off the enemy and sacrificed himself and so forth. But then we saw that when he went into the forum, he cheated. So we couldn't just say he was virtuous. He had an aspect of virtue. He then goes through the other two cardinal virtues, and sort of looking at each one in its own context, and says then in that case there we saw that virtue had been completed. Virtue is a kind of composite of all the most admirable human traits, but also with its own theorem. I mean, it's not that courage is not the same thing as justice, because justice involves the distribution of goods.
Right.
Courage involves showing appropriate fear.
So you described virtue as this total whole,
yes.
right? All or nothing, and you can make progress towards, but the full virtue is all the virtues essentially. And obviously, there are many theories, especially in ancient philosophy, that give a lot of emphasis to virtue. And intuitively, it makes sense why virtue and action and agency and how you respond to things matter, and not just the external circumstance. But the Stoics go a step further, right? And I think the best example here is Cicero's De Finibus, where he gives Stoics two Roman statesmen who are as virtuous as statesmen come. And one of them, entire family died, and just the worst things happened to him. And another one, like all 5 kids survive, 3 of them become consuls, and all kinds of Roman glories, and then he dies peacefully in his bed. And Cicero asked the Stoics, these are equally extremely virtuous people. Are they the same happiness? And the Stoics say, yes. Help us understand that. Why would someone like Epictetus say that people who are very virtuous but have drastically different external circumstance are the same happiness?
Well, because the value that virtue instantiates is quite a different value from these, these
external goods.
It's a disposition of the mind. So it's not something that can be acquired. It's something that can be grown into, but it's a mental state. Now, that doesn't show why it's an absolute, why there couldn't be.
Yeah, of course, right.
Chrysippus says, the person who has performed every appropriate action is not yet happy. There's something else, there's something still missing. And that I think is this disposition. And it's why the Stoics generally said, perhaps some may have varied, that virtue once acquired could not be lost. It might be lost under circumstances not of your own choosing.
Right.
If you went mad or something like that.
But help us understand this a bit more, because I thought the objection you raised just there was a very good one, which is, even though we may agree that having virtue has a lot of value, and it's a value that's of the mind, it's not clear why it's total, right? Because let's say we bring in just average person on the street. We describe these two lives, extremely virtuous. One has all the external goods. One has none of the external goods and all of the external bads.
Yes.
And we ask them, are they equally happy? And the person on the street just simply says no. That seems to be a fundamental value disagreement with the Stoics. What would the Stoics say to that? I
think different approaches. One would be to turn to Stoic physics at this point and say, well, what is the nature of this disposition that you're talking about? And it's actually it's a physical state. It's not. It's a tension of the special fiery pneuma that constitutes the soul, and that is an all or nothing state. I think they realize that they're saying something paradoxical. They say the man at the point when a human being becomes a sage, there's like a microsecond. It doesn't even. He's not aware of it. Then that's a paradox. They acknowledge that's a paradox, but nonetheless, something has changed. It is a true paradox, because you'd think if it's not even perceptible, it must be so slight as to know. And yet, I think the answer would be the state of virtue, as the Stoics want to conceive of it, is so extraordinary. It's so that
everything pales in comparison to its brightness, or something like that.
Exactly. Even though subjectively it may not feel different.
Right.
But you're now incapable of error.
So therefore, maybe a helpful analogy for people who are familiar with the Buddhist tradition is like the Buddha, where his phenomenology is just so fundamentally different from ours that it assumes that the layperson will not be able to understand this difference, something like that.
Yeah, but I think that if you then say, well, these are paradoxes, it's not very helpful. I think the Stoics would reply, well, what we're trying to do is to capture the best possible state of affairs.
Right.
Not something which is intuitively obvious. After all, we're saying that maybe there never has been.
Right.
There never has been a perfectly virtuous person, and therefore not even a virtuous person at all.
Let me draw out a tension between what might be an orthodox Stoic view and what might be Epictetus' view. So Orthodox Stoic use the metaphor of a person in his Stoic practice, and no matter how much he progresses, he's still drowning, right? He's rising from the depths of the ocean, but even if he's 1 centimeter below, he still can't breathe. And it's only the full sage that has happiness. So the Stoics has a very extreme view. It's either all or nothing. You're the sage or you're equally miserable, something like that. Epictetus, however, wants to focus on progression. And progression, presumably, as you progress on this Stoic path, as you care less about these external goods, as you focus and develop more of your virtue, you should live a better life and not be equally drowning. So how does this square?
Well, better in what sense? Are you talking about?
Experientially, like it's a more worthy life in some sense.
Yes, right, that's correct. But he's not. I don't think Epictetus is interested in saying, well, here are these two people, and let's compare them. I don't think he ever makes that kind of comparison, not the one that Cicero makes with the senators, which obviously is a very challenging one. You're definitely going to say as a Stoic, one life is preferable to the other. You're going to say one's preferable because what makes something preferable is its being in accordance with nature.
Right.
And to lose all your
wife and your children and your property and your career. So they're forced to say something like, even though both lives are equally happy, one is more preferable than the other. Right.
I think so.
And stepping aside from within the Stoic view, do you find this plausible? Do you find their emphasis on, you're one of the greatest scholars on Epictetus. Do you find this plausible after wrestling with it for so long?
No, I don't, because I don't accept this radical distinction between the goodness of an action and the goodness of a state of affairs. The guy who rescues the child from the burning house, or doesn't rescue the child, you surely do want to say it would have been better if the child had survived. Wouldn't have made the quality of the action was the same.
Right. But these are both real goods.
Yes,
and the Stoics,
that's what I think. That I think is the hardest thing in Stoic ethics.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I actually think there's a harder thing in Stoic ethics, other than this totalitarian focus on virtue, which is this idea of preferred indifference, right? Because unlike the Cynic, who may even have agreed with all the Stoics points we've discussed so far, right, that the external goods are not that important, the Stoics then do a 180 and say, nonetheless, these external goods that are indifferent, some of them, wealth, honor, health, are preferable. So help us make sense of that distinction. How can something be preferable and indifferent at the same time?
It's indifferent to your happiness.
Right.
Whether you are wealthy or poor, healthy or sick. That's your happiness is unimpaired by that. But it's incumbent on you as a Stoic to care for your health and to care for your property, because both those things are natural. Several Stoics define the summum bonum as doing everything in one's power to select the most important things according to nature. So selecting the preferables is part of the summum bonum.
Right.
And Cicero says, and this is where he says Aristo and the Cynics go wrong, because if you don't say that there are actual objective values of that kind, then there's no reason to do anything.
Right, yeah, precisely. I mean, the way I think about it is, if these are just fully indifference, virtue loses its basis.
Right.
I mean, think about moderation, right? Moderation clearly is relative. If I'm a sumo wrestler, I eat 5,000 calories a day, and that's virtuous. Right. If I'm a ballerina, I eat, 1,500 calories a day, and that's moderate. But if you tell me health is completely indifferent, and my weight is completely indifferent, then suddenly, even I can't have the basis for any virtue.
Right.
That's the concern.
In Epictetus, he quotes Chrysippus, and the quote goes like this. He says, where the future is uncertain, I always stick to what's best calculated to secure the things in accordance with nature. Because God, he says, has given me that power to select them. That's the first point. Then he says, but if I knew now that I was fated to be sick, I would embrace sickness. So again, it looks like a paradox, but I think it isn't. It's saying that other things being equal, go for the preferred things, but not without recognizing where the thing you're in the world.
Right. But there's another condition, even without knowing fate, I think, where you would also choose the dispreferred in some circumstances, which is, for example, we know that wealth, for example, is not just monotonic to the happiness or even to children's upbringing.
Right.
There's a lot of billionaires who actually tell their children, I'm not going to give you any money. I'm going to give all this money away. Because they realize that it's a moderate amount of money.
Yes.
And not just the maximum amount of money possible that's good for an upbringing.
Right.
So even without knowing that one is fated to be poor, there's already circumstances where virtue tells you to choose the dispreferred, different, right?
Yeah, but I think this, let me go back, my suggestion that Epictetus is not interested in coming up with moral rules or categorical imperatives. The sage, like everybody else, some sages or potential sages, will have a very strong sex drive, and others will not. So so everybody has to weigh up their own conditions. I mean, very much like the way Aristotle says when he's talking about the mean. You discern, what are your propensities? What are your weaknesses? What are your strengths?
In your book, you suggest that Epictetus kind of breaks from the traditional Orthodox Stoic view of preferred indifference, or at least gives it a lot less emphasis.
Well,
is that right?
Certainly the latter. That's no doubt at all. That's correct. Yes, I guess at one point that he seems to be on the side of the Stoic Aristo, who was the one who was heterodox, the one who did go against the doctrine of preferred indifference. He certainly gives it no emphasis. But then he does give the quote I just mentioned, that when the future is uncertain, I go for it. So it's not that he's rejecting it. I think for reasons I'm not sure I understand. He just doesn't emphasize it at all.
So it seems like when we pursue this ethical argument, the one that stems from Plato's Gorgias and that goes through this reasoning about external goods not being always good, virtue always being good.
The Euthydemus.
Yes. We do bottom out to this idea of nature.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, the argument goes to it is natural. Like the reason the Stoics are not like the Cynics and they just live with dogs and masturbate in public is because they have a very strong view of what the nature of man is, but also the nature of the cosmos. So let's move to the third argument I suggested, the nature argument. What does it mean for us to be a rational animal for the Stoics? And most importantly, why is that important? Because surely we can transcend our nature. Like if it's better to transcend our nature, if let's say wombs are made to have babies, and let's say we have artificial wombs that do it without all this hassle. So yeah, explain this natural argument for us.
Well, you have we all have a physical nature, a musculature and blood circulation, all that. But when they're talking about living in accordance to nature, they're talking about the mental as a level of psychology, we could say, right? And not talking about physiology. So nature then is to be thought of as an evolving thing. So you've got, infant behavior, and there's some good stuff in Seneca about this. about different stages of nature, different stages of life where different things are appropriate. So there's the kind of notion from the infantile to the mature.
Right.
And so nature is gradated accordingly. That's relatively straightforward, I think. But then, there's the question about your nature. And you're not just your nature as a human being, but as your nature, this person of this age living in this society, and so on, so on, so on. So I think this is where, again, Stoics, I think, are going beyond Plato and Aristotle in the introspection that's required. I mean, it is the know yourself.
Right.
Know yourself has been around all the time. But knowing yourself here is going to be much more complicated, I think, than Plato and Aristotle perhaps acknowledged. I think Marcus Aurelius gets this fairly well when he talks about his experiences, and he I think there's a sense in which Marcus is revealing what his strengths and weaknesses are, and so I think that's something very important for a Stoic. And again, it's why categorical imperatives are not going to work, I think, here.
Right. But what about my more meta-level question about, let's say we determine our nature to be X.
Yes.
If there's a better way to do the activity at hand, why ought we follow our nature? It's a more like meta-ethical question about why, like, even if we can determine what our nature is.
I think because I think in the way you answer the question, I think because the preoccupation of modern philosophers, with what is the appropriate thing to do, all things considered in this, I think that's too abstract.
Right.
It's not. That shouldn't be. It shouldn't be the appropriate thing to do. It's the appropriate thing for me to do.
Right. I see. There's more of a teleological understanding of the human. Is it something like that we were almost made to do something in the same way that the tool was made to do?
Yes, and it's sort of also the kind of ought implies can. I mean, a lot of modern ethics, meta-ethics, has become almost like a kind of mathematics, hasn't it? Sort of,
right, a calculus of sorts.
Yes, a kind of calculus. And I think I see very little of that in Epictetus. Yeah.
The other common critique I see, especially of the Roman Stoics, is to say what they're calling nature is really just smuggling in Roman values of like wealth, honor. And so that is a slightly different objection, which is how does one know what one's nature is? Because surely, health, let's say, right? But something like wealth, it's not clear that it's in our nature to be wealthy, right? So how does one go about determining one's nature?
I think empirically, to quite an extent, I think, I think the Stoics would probably think it's, like even Epictetus has his lamp, property ownership is somehow natural in the sense that, it's normal. And normal and therefore an appropriate because it's not that you can't live without property, but it's society wouldn't work. So I think these things can be empirically determined. But I wanted to go back to, you rightly brought up whether the naturalistic fallacy is invoked. And I think it probably is with the Epicureans. I think they are trying to say...
With Epictetus, you mean?
Yeah, no, I mean Epicureans.
Right.
Yeah, I think, in arguing that good means pleasurable, that someone like G. Moore, who invoked the fallacy, wouldn't like. I think the Stoics don't. I don't think Stoic virtue is liable to that. I think what Moore would like about Epictetus and the Stoics is that they are saying that virtue is sui generis. You can't define it. You can define it in the way you can call it the perfection of a rational being, but that's a formal definition. It's not like saying it consists of the following properties. That's the problem with the naturalistic fallacy. You list a set of ingredients.
Right.
Whereas it's not like that. You can do the preferred indifference like ingredients, your health, wealth, you can run them off. But you can't do that with virtue. I think so.
Right, because it's about the appropriate action in the exact scenario that's quite unique, and so you can't really flesh it out. Is that
yes?
the
It's about this disposition of the mind, the rational faculty, which has somehow clicked, and now it's sort of it's locked in place.
Right, I see. Let's examine the last argument that I discussed, which is the argument from control. So let me give you a quote from your book. Happiness can be changelessly ours, Epictetus proposes, but only if we completely limit our desires and aversions to the domain in which we are capable of being autonomous, the domain of agency, rationality, judgment, and volition. For that to be achieved, we need to detach our desires and aversions from everything that is not ours, that is to say, our bodies and all external circumstances, including even the material welfare of our family and friends. He takes it to be self-evident that people want their desires to be fulfilled, yet their actual desires are frequently frustrated and consequently cause them distress. The problem here, he suggests, is not in wanting a desire to be fulfilled. Human beings naturally seek the fulfillment of their desires. Accordingly, the remedy for frustration is to focus one's desires exclusively within the area where success is assured. This seems to be almost a completely different argument than the ethical one, religious one, or the one from nature that we've discussed already. And it seems to be liable, standing just on its own. It seems to be liable to the obvious response, which is, well, what if we need more things than what is in our control to be happy? Does that make sense? So the question for you is, does this argument stand on its own ground, or does it require the other arguments to bolster it?
Okay, good. Epictetus is liable to be, he doesn't have an in-depth understanding of the complexity of our neurological system. Say the problems that an addictive personality might have. So he's probably a bit glib in the way he talks about control here. I think there are a lot of things about our human behavior which are not controllable, that he perhaps assumes a bit too readily are. I should say, though, given the quotation from me that you gave there, he does distinguish between desires and inclinations. He does a desire. In the second of the manual, he says at this point you should give up desires altogether. He doesn't mean that that's a long-term project, but desires are sort of longing for something when you're really putting your whole
attachment, right?
Yes. Whereas an inclination is just a sort of almost like a reflex action, and we're not meant to be able to get rid of those. So your worry here then was that the sort of policy recommendations about control don't seem to fit into the bigger picture that we were talking about.
Oh, I was saying something different, which was that if we already agree, if we have the virtue argument from ethics, then this is just a nice cherry on top, right? Because what is happiness? Happiness is determined by virtue.
Yes.
Virtue is fully in our control. Happiness is fully in our control.
Yes.
My concern is that the way that I read it here and the way that I see a lot of modern Stoics argue is you should focus only on virtue because it's in your control, and therefore happiness will be in your control.
Oh, yes, I see.
But then the question is, what if happiness requires things more than virtue? Now, obviously, the ethical argument already argues against that.
Yes.
But it seems to require that. So that's my question. This does not stand alone on its two legs, right?
Yeah, I think that, I agree with you that I think a lot of moderns, and maybe I'm liable to this too at some point, I think, it sounds a bit like a very prudential argument.
Right.
If you don't want to be disappointed, don't wish for the moon or something like that.
Don't study calculus. Just do algebra. Yeah.
He may be liable to that objection. I think the reason why he makes this the first in the manual, it's the first one he really concentrates on. He says some things are up to us, other things are not, and then distinguishes them. And this is a very favorite passage for modern Stoics. But I think it's because if you don't follow that advice, then then people are going to, it's not just that they will be disappointed. How can you, in any sense of happiness, so that whether it's subjective or objective, how could you make a good shot at it if you opt for things that you have no guarantee of getting? I mean, so in other words,
right.
The idea is that a rational plan of life,
right,
requires you to make something like this distinction, because otherwise, it's not just that you're going to be disappointed; you're just going to fail.
Right. But, okay, hold on. But surely someone who believes that external goods are a component of happiness, like for example Aristotle, they simply say yes, and therefore life is tragic, right? Like, of course, like achieving life's greatest goal, happiness, presumes that I could fail at doing it. If fortune, the example he gives in the Nicomachean Ethics is Priam. I could do everything right until my life, and at the end, all of my sons die, I get killed, my city gets captured. So it seems like... Yeah, go ahead.
Remember what he says after that. What he says after that is, nonetheless, even if you lose all your children like Priam, but if you have virtue, this is Aristotle speaking, then it shines out. So he is, and I think what you said about Aristotle's reason for saying we need some external goods is not because he thinks that external goods have value per se.
Right.
I used to think that, and some people might still think that. I think it's because if you don't have any wealth, if you just, you can't be generous.
Right.
You need external goods to a certain extent in order to act virtuously.
Right, I see.
Now, I don't know if the Stoics would agree with that. It seems a common sense point.
So maybe let's imagine someone who does believe external goods are a core component of happiness, right? And there are many philosophies who are like this.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
There, if you told them the argument, well, but sir, if you focus on the external goods, you're not guaranteed to be happy. And then their response would be, yes, and that's why life can be tragic.
Someone like David Hume is going to bring in this. He's going to say, look, there's that famous passage in Hume where he says, there would be nothing irrational in deciding that if you were offered a choice between destroying the whole world or not, I suppose, it would not be irrational to choose to destroy the world. So Hume is just kind of challenging any kind of generalizations about this. And he's basically saying, human beings are just infinitely varied, and you can't. So I think that would be the answer there.
So for Epictetus, what precisely does he think is in our control?
Oh, well, I'm very glad you asked that, because this, I think, is one of his most important and crucial distinctions. The Greek word here is fantasia. Fantasia, it's a favorite word of Aristotle's too. It's anything that appears to you. So he doesn't think that, let's say, the appearance of the fireplace or the taste of the water, none of these things are up to us. They're just given to us. So all our sensory input, and not only our sensory input, but all kinds of things like fleeting thoughts, imaginations, sudden sexual desire or a wish for a hamburger. These things just come into our heads. All we can do then, but what we can do, is determine our responses to them, whether we like it or not. So that for him, that's the crucial domain of distinguishing between what's in our control and what's not. The things that are under our control are he says, how we use our impressions, how we respond to them. And this would then be meant to be a primary distinction with the non-rational animals, that they just act instinctively.
Right.
Which may not be totally true, of course, but I think,
My concern here then would be, if his claim is that our responses are fully in our control, there's a lot of modern psychology that seems to go against that. The extent to which our own desires or judgments are mimetic or externalized from society, or compulsions that are not rational in the way that he thinks they are. Does he have a good response to that?
His answer to the objection would be, don't have to act on first impressions. And another very important distinction he makes is between what he calls passions, which are fully fledged value judgments, like this is terrible or this is desirable, and what he calls pre-passions, which are, let's say, an earthquake. Even the wise man is going to fall off his chair, or example Seneca gives often is somebody who's liable to blush. You can't. So a lot of things he thinks are not under our control, but where there's a full-fledged judgment involved that this is desirable or non-desirable or fearful or anything of that sort, those can be kind of initial impressions which we can hold back from. And so sometimes he even says that making and of course impressions are important to us. We couldn't act without them. So making proper use of our impressions is vital. So of course, if in a military situation, there'd be times when you need to hold back. You need to withdraw. You don't want to rush it, So this is part of, if we talked a bit about rationality and what that involves, this is very important part of that, I think. Yeah.
So we talked about these 4 different arguments that sort of ground Epictetus' philosophy. I want to talk about the other side of Stoicism, which is like the therapy, right? There's what the world is and how our sense work and judgments work and what has value and it does not have value and what the nature of the world is. And then there's what to do about it. So tell us a bit about what are the therapeutic prescriptions that Epictetus prescribes to students?
Yeah, they are typically, imagining a certain situation. There might be a sexual situation. Imagine that person coming and being available to you, and then you test yourself out, and so you challenge yourself
in your imagination.
Yes, right. Or it might not even be. It might be beyond it. It might be in a real situation where
you put yourself in risk or to see if you can withstand.
And you learn about your own weaknesses and strengths this way, and so that's one kind of therapeutic exercise. But I think beyond that's just in a very specific sense. But I think much more important perhaps is it would bring us back to perhaps even theology and cosmology, is having a view of the state of the world, trying to put things into perspective, and saying, well. And more than that, not just imagining it, thinking about it, but what can I do about it? I think that's the crucial thing. Perhaps
focusing on the agency.
Yes, and why emotions? It's not that Stoics care about emotions per se. It's because emotions or passions are disabling. I mean, accepting your own. It's not just autonomy. It's also that everything that matters to you is. Depends on your judgments. You're thinking about what it's like.
Right.
So in that sense, I think that's where the modern Stoics, have something to offer. They try to apply. They try to apply the teaching of someone like Epictetus to very ordinary, everyday situations.
Right. In your work with Epictetus, what do you think are the biggest issues with either his theory specifically or the theory of the Stoics in general?
Yeah, well, I think some of them we just touched on. I think the question of whether he's a little bit too cavalier about what we can control, and he's tolerant of other people's shortcomings. I mean, but I think at the same time he can be a bit censorious, and there are times that I don't want to read him. I mean, when he says things like, it does no harm when you're kissing your child to say, tomorrow you may be dead.
Right. Marcus Aurelius quotes that in the Meditations.
Yeah, yes. He does. And I like some of the sort of very ordinary stuff. So, I mean, the kind of, you go to the bathhouse and somebody stole your towel, and you, instead of getting mad, you just say, oh well, maybe he needed it more than I did, or something like that.
Right.
A kind of coming to terms. I mean, I suppose this is traditional Stoicism, just sort of trying to maintain your equanimity in all circumstances.
Right.
But I think what modern Stoics have missed a lot is the challenge, the challenge there. It isn't, I don't think it's, therapy in the sense we're talking about it is not primarily what it's about. I think what it's about is what it's called trying to
be at home in the world.
Yeah, achieve harmony in the world.
Right.
Harmony, we haven't used that term much, but the notion of harmony, both psychological harmony, but harmony with your circumstances.
Right, I see. Whereas the modern Stoics have taken out the therapeutic devices, because it's easier to take out, right? Because the harmony kind of requires a larger religious worldview.
And I mean, we haven't talked about anger, but I mean, anger is almost fashionable today. It's,
right, yeah.
And I mean,
as it was in Rome in the time, is my understanding, right? Yeah.
And I mean, Seneca, have you ever read Seneca's work on anger?
Yes, on anger, on clemency.
It's amazing. I don't think anything better has ever been written on anger than that. He says it's never justified to be angry. But
you've almost become a friend of Epictetus, right? You've done so much work on his theory. You've read his book so carefully. Do you think his psychology of a Stoic is something you would trade lives with? Is it, because the reason I ask that is because I'm reading Marcus Aurelius' Meditations now, and what we often think about the Stoic is unperturbed, tranquil, and that's all true. But there's a kind of gentleness of Aurelius. There's a kind of appreciation of beauty. There's a joy
there is.
that I often miss. And so
I think that's true. Yeah. Well, I mean, because Marcus, I think he is a wonderful writer, and some of his images are superb. And yes, I think so. But his melancholy is a bit too much for me at times.
Right.
And this,
do you find that in Epictetus? Do you find the same?
No. I don't find melancholy at all in Epictetus. And also what you mentioned, amor fati. Everything that's right for you, O world, is right for me. There's no, I don't think resignation, and that must come from Marcus's experiences. And he's writing these little pieces in his tent during the wars.
Right, I see.
And he had, by any normal standards, he had a pretty horrible life.
Right.
Lost so many children. Yeah.
So what do you find most attractive about Epictetus' worldview?
I mean, some of it I don't accept, because I don't accept the theology, really. I don't accept that.
But it sounds like you struggle with the ethics as well, right?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the modern Stoics, it's interesting, they're very selective about what they like. They don't read Cicero much. I mean, Cicero he's a bit bland, I think, at times, but he was incredibly influential. And Cicero's work on duties is the first book after the Bible to be printed.
Wow.
So there was a time when everybody read it. Stoicism has waned in popularity, and then it's come back again. I mean, clearly it's on the popular side at the moment. I mean, there was this famous Belgian scholar called Justus Lipsius, and he made Stoicism very popular around the 1600s, when there were horrible religious wars were going on in Europe. And he wrote a work called De Constantia, which is very famous. And I think they're saying in the 19th century, where we had a much more progressivist view of the future, I think Stoicism went out of fashion, especially in England.
Right, the resilience, the sort of resonation, right?
No, we're all on the right track. We're making things better. And now where are we? I don't know where we are at the moment, but it does seem as if it's capturing a nerve at the moment.
I see.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you for a fascinating interview.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then go join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, essays, and invitations to future lectures. Now, if you like this interview, I actually filmed another one with Professor Anthony Long on Hellenistic philosophy, which I think you'll find fascinating as well. You can find the link to that interview and links to everything we covered today in the description, as well as on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.